In a shocking move that has left royal insiders gasping, Princess Anne has just barred Meghan Markle's representatives from attending a major Commonwealth event, an unprecedented power play that signals a tectonic shift within the monarchy. What could have triggered this last-minute decision, and why now when the eyes of the world are locked on the House of Windsor? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It was a moment that stunned even the most seasoned palace aides. 6 minutes before the event was set to begin, a sudden internal directive from Princess Anne's office instructed security teams to reject the credentials of Meghan's appointed representatives. These were not low-tier staff, they were senior strategists, fully cleared, fully briefed, and expected to take part in high-level discussions on post-colonial reconciliation, youth empowerment, and royal diplomacy. Yet just moments before they were meant to enter, they were stopped cold. There was no negotiation, no explanation, only a sharp final access revoked, and in that instant, the temperature across Buckingham's inner circles shifted. This wasn't a scheduling mix-up or a clerical error. It was deliberate, ruthless, and personal. Behind the polished veneer of royal unity, tensions between Princess Anne and Meghan Markle have been quietly building to a breaking point. Those closest to the inner chambers speak of a cold war waged through silence, smirks, and carefully placed comments, nothing outright, but everything pointed. Meghan's push for progressive reform, her media prowess, and her bold approach to modernizing monarchy values were never fully embraced by Anne, who still wears the scars of defending tradition under Queen Elizabeth's command. When Meghan broke with royal convention, Anne didn't flinch outwardly, but insiders say she never forgot. And she never forgave. The Commonwealth event at the center of this storm wasn't just another diplomatic gathering. It was deeply symbolic. A bridge between generations, between monarchies and modernity. It was where Princess Anne had long held silent command, weaving soft power and old-world influence in ways few understood, but all respected. Meghan, from across the Atlantic, had started building her own bridges into the same space, quietly aligning with youth leaders, influencers, and even grassroots representatives from member nations. The tension reached a boiling point the moment Meghan's camp announced their intention to send official representatives. That announcement, subtle but bold, was taken by Anne as a direct challenge, and Princess Anne, the woman known as the steel spine of the crown, responded the only way she knew how, with finality. Sources suggest Anne's move was never about just protocol. It was a warning, a line in the sand. Meghan, once viewed as the breath of fresh air the monarchy needed, had now crossed into Anne's sacred ground. And there would be consequences. Queen Elizabeth had trusted Anne with the Commonwealth legacy, whispering on more than one occasion that Anne understood its delicate balance better than anyone alive. In Anne's mind, Meghan's encroachment wasn't just misjudged, it was dangerous. And in the 6 minutes before the world watched, Anne took control. But to understand why Princess Anne made this explosive decision, we must dive deep into the cracks forming within the monarchy where loyalty is currency, and betrayal never sleeps. This wasn't an overnight fallout. The friction between Princess Anne and Meghan Markle began in whispers, behind closed doors, long before either of them took opposing sides in public. Now, the consequences are erupting on the world stage. It started subtly. During Meghan's first official tours, Anne's silence was deafening. While other senior royals offered cautious nods or occasional public praise, Anne remained still stoic, observant, unmoved. Those who know her well claim she watched with sharp eyes, noting everything from Meghan's spontaneous speeches to her break from dress codes. Behind the scenes, courtiers whispered that Anne viewed Meghan's rise with suspicion not because of her background, but because of her speed. Anne had spent decades earning respect in the shadows of duty. Meghan, to her, was rewriting the royal script far too fast. Sources say that when Meghan was fast-tracked into high-level events and given centre stage in engagements previously reserved for senior royals, Anne bristled. There was no confrontation. Anne never needed one. Her power didn't come from outbursts, but from quiet resistance. She reportedly declined invitations to join engagements that included Meghan, citing scheduling conflicts that conveniently aligned with tension. When Queen Elizabeth, nearing the twilight of her reign, sought to reinforce stability within the family, she quietly turned to Anne. The Queen didn't issue commands, she gave signals. And one of them, insiders believe, was a subtle instruction. Keep the Commonwealth steady. That responsibility wasn't offered to Meghan, nor William, nor even Charles. It was placed on Anne's shoulders that had carried decades of the crown's burden without ever buckling. In those final years, the Queen's confidences to Anne became more frequent. Meghan, meanwhile, was carving out a global platform, one that increasingly extended into Commonwealth realms. Youth leaders, grassroots campaigns, media outlets, many began leaning toward Meghan's progressive messaging. While some in the palace tried to adapt to the changing tide, Anne stood firm. Duty wasn't meant to be updated. It was meant to be upheld. And when Meghan's team launched independent initiatives in Commonwealth countries without informing senior royal liaisons, that quiet resistance within Anne began to shift toward active defense. Reports emerged that Anne had declined to sit on panels involving Meghan's representatives. It wasn't protocol, it was a statement. Unlike Catherine, who had reportedly offered guidance and subtle alignment with Meghan in the early days, Anne refused to mentor her. The Princess Royal was never one to play palace games or stage manufactured unity. She believed in merit. And in her view, Meghan hadn't earned the right to steer royal influence across the Commonwealth. To Anne, Meghan's rise wasn't just disruptive, it was dangerous. It threatened to undermine decades of carefully maintained relationships, built through quiet diplomacy and personal sacrifice. As Meghan's team expanded its influence across Commonwealth territories, the tension with Anne deepened. What began as a cold indifference morphed into a guarded opposition, one that no longer stayed behind closed doors. As this feud intensifies, a secret meeting long buried and never discussed publicly emerges from the shadows, and it may hold the key to Anne's recent decision. Buried in the archives of palace correspondence lies a classified memo sent to senior royals, one that Meghan allegedly wasn't meant to see, but she did. And what it revealed may have set off a royal chain reaction that ends with today's dramatic shutdown. The document, drafted quietly in the months following the Sussexes' exit from royal duties, was intended for eyes behind gilded doors only. It outlined a new framework for Commonwealth engagements, placing strict boundaries around who could represent the monarchy in an official capacity. At first glance, it seemed procedural, just another bureaucratic ripple in the aftermath of Megxit. But tucked within the language of policy was a sentence that would detonate like a bomb. Meghan's presence was noted as non-essential but presentable. Those 4 words were more than a dismissal, they were a coded verdict, effectively labeling her as ornamental, not operational. Meghan's discovery of the memo wasn't planned. A well-placed palace staffer, disillusioned by what they saw as a quiet campaign to erase Meghan's influence, had leaked the document to a private source within Meghan's network. When it landed in her hands, Meghan was blindsided not just by the content, but by the authorship. One of the names stamped in bold at the top, Princess Anne. It was a moment of clarity and betrayal fused together. While Anne had always kept Meghan at a distance, this confirmed that the divide wasn't just personal, it was strategic. The Queen's signature, curiously, was absent from the document. That absence raised even more questions. Had Her Majesty refused to sign? Or had the memo been pushed through without her full consent? Either possibility sent chills through the Sussex camp. The walls were moving behind them and someone had pulled the blueprint. From that point forward, Meghan's approach began to evolve. She no longer pursued joint royal initiatives, but instead launched her own outside of palace jurisdiction, but strategically aligned with the very causes the monarchy claimed to champion. Women's rights, racial equity, youth empowerment in former colonies, these became the battlegrounds where Meghan would reassert her voice. Behind the scenes, Anne was not oblivious. She saw the shifts. She heard the speeches. And she understood what they meant. Meghan wasn't retreating, she was realigning, turning the snub into a strategy. That memo, never meant to be read outside the firm, had now become the spark for something larger. It confirmed Meghan's suspicion that the royals were quietly cutting her off from future representation, while still exploiting the optics of diversity her image afforded. Anne, the master of quiet control, had drawn a boundary. Meghan, in return, began to redraw the map. It wasn't just a memo. It was a message. And it travelled further than Anne ever intended. The slow burn that followed reached Commonwealth allies, press rooms, and think tanks abroad. Whispers turned into warnings. Was Meghan being deliberately sidelined from the very cause she once championed as a royal? And if so, what did that say about the institution's promises of inclusivity? Meghan never publicly acknowledged the document, but those closest to her say it altered everything. She began building influence not through protocol, but through pressure. And just as the fallout from that memo reached boiling point, Meghan's next move would ignite deeper conflict, this time by stepping into Anne's most protected domain. To the world, the Commonwealth is a network of nations. But to Princess Anne, it's a legacy she's bled for, guarded, championed and moulded under her mother's watchful eye. So when Meghan began manoeuvring into that space, Anne felt something she rarely shows: betrayal. For decades, Anne wasn't just a royal figurehead in the Commonwealth, she was the monarchy's quiet force, carrying out visits in blistering heat, sitting through endless discussions behind closed doors, and forging personal relationships with leaders long after the media had turned its gaze elsewhere. Where others saw symbolic duty, Anne saw a living chain, the last true legacy of her mother's reign. And unlike others in the firm, Anne never courted applause. Her presence was her statement. But that very presence, earned through grit and unglamorous commitment, began to feel under siege the moment Meghan's team started launching parallel initiatives. Without stepping foot back into a royal role, Meghan's influence began resurfacing, this time through community-based campaigns, digital outreach, and targeted philanthropic programs that resonated with younger Commonwealth audiences. From California, Meghan's representatives, fluent in global activism and digital diplomacy, were making moves in regions Anne had spent a lifetime nurturing. While Meghan never claimed the title, her reach began resembling that of an unofficial ambassador. This shift wasn't just noticed, it was warned against. Palace staff, already stretched thin, quietly informed Anne that certain territories were expressing more public enthusiasm for Meghan's team than for royal events in the pipeline. In hushed corridors and under diplomatic reports, a disturbing phrase surfaced: Anne's influence was being modernized out. What stung most wasn't the reach, it was the erasure. Anne, who had once gone to Zimbabwe under threat, who navigated complex political terrain in the Caribbean, and who stood firm during the most turbulent years of post-colonial diplomacy, was being slowly pushed to the margins in favor of a brand. And while Meghan may not have intended to replace Anne's legacy, the effect was the same. Letters of endorsement that once bore Anne's seal now came with sleek Californian logos. Youth conferences previously under the royal patronage now cited new partnerships, ones that echoed Meghan's post-royal agenda. The palace, ever fearful of another PR nightmare, stayed silent. But Anne could feel the tide. She could hear the careful wording in briefings. She could see her space shrinking. There was one person whose voice still echoed in Anne's mind. In the quiet of those final years, Queen Elizabeth reportedly took Anne's hand and said something no one else ever heard: "Guard it as I did." It wasn't a command, it was a passing of the torch. Not in headlines or ceremonies, but in whispered trust. Anne had interpreted that vow as sacred. And now, she felt it under siege by someone who had turned their back on the institution, only to circle back and lay claim to its most fragile arm. Anne's response wasn't theatrical. She didn't need grand gestures. But what brewed beneath her silence was deeper than protocol. It was a storm of loyalty, duty, and pride. She was ready to fight not for titles, but for the promise she made to her mother. But Anne's fury wasn't just political, it was personal. And what happened at a private strategy summit between William, Anne, and Charles would set a new course. In the dead of night, behind palace walls, Prince William and Princess Anne convened without staff, without advisors, and without Charles's approval. What they decided in that tense meeting would rewrite the rules of royal engagement, and Meghan was at the heart of it. It wasn't scheduled, it wasn't documented, and yet its consequences would be felt across every corner of the Commonwealth. By this point, both Anne and William had reached a shared conclusion: Meghan's influence wasn't diminishing in exile. It was mutating. From California boardrooms to virtual summits and curated philanthropic spotlights, Meghan had begun to redefine what it meant to be royal, and William saw the looming threat. The throne he was preparing to inherit was being reshaped by someone who had stepped away from its structure, but was now redefining its image from outside. And in Anne, he found someone who didn't just share his concern, she had already done the homework. What Anne laid out that evening wasn't just opinion. It was intelligence dossiers compiled from royal security briefings, diplomatic notes, and confidential advisor summaries. The files painted a picture of Meghan's unofficial but increasingly formal engagement with Commonwealth causes. Youth programs, women's initiatives, and cultural diplomacy efforts had been launched under new non-profit umbrellas, but their reach extended into royal territory. Anne called it unofficial diplomatic overreach, and William didn't argue. It wasn't just that Meghan's influence was growing, it was that it was unregulated, unaffiliated, and potentially irreversible. They needed a strategy. And fast. So, they drafted one, a comprehensive recalibration of Commonwealth-facing events, beginning with a quiet but sharp reassertion of royal protocol. Every appearance, every communication, every future partnership now required an internal review, one not by the monarch, but by a newly formed internal council Anne herself would discreetly lead. And more critically, they agreed that Meghan's name nor her representatives would be invited, included, or even mentioned in future official documentation. It wouldn't be public. It wouldn't be loud. It would be surgical. Charles, at first, resisted. He believed in keeping the waters calm, in maintaining at least a thin veil of diplomacy. But after Anne and William presented him with projections of Meghan's rising influence in African and Caribbean nations once loyal to the Queen, he caved. His approval came not in a declaration, but in a subtle nod during a closed-door discussion, the kind of royal signal that carries more weight than policy itself. Meghan's team, meanwhile, continued to operate without knowledge of the trap now forming around them. Communications were no longer answered, invitations quietly vanished, and connections once warm began to chill. What began as a midnight summit had become a containment strategy, one forged not out of jealousy, but preservation. Meghan had stepped beyond her role, and now the firm would quietly cut the ropes. Still, one voice was missing from this alliance, until a surprising ally emerged from an unlikely place, an insider close to Meghan herself. Not all betrayals come from across the aisle. Some come from those you trust the most. Meghan's inner circle was tight, or so she believed. But one staffer, with access to private strategies and meetings, began leaking information to Anne's camp. The betrayal didn't come in a single blow. It came slowly, through subtle shifts in timing, strange coincidences, and briefings that seemed to go cold just as they were about to heat up. The mole wasn't new to palace life. Before stepping into Meghan's trusted sphere, this individual had served directly under Princess Anne, learning not just royal protocol, but the discipline of quiet warfare. Their placement within Meghan's circle was seen by many as an act of reconciliation between old and new. But now, it's clear it was infiltration. From the moment they crossed into Meghan's camp, the damage began. Internal memos began arriving at Anne's office with alarming precision details of Meghan's upcoming meetings, speaking engagements, and donor strategies. Timing wasn't just a coincidence. Meghan's public diplomacy moments, especially those tied to Commonwealth youth outreach, were being disrupted, rerouted, or overshadowed. Major outlets would suddenly pull back coverage. Strategic allies would go silent after a briefing. And Meghan, though suspicious, could never quite trace the route. To the outside world, it looked like missteps. But within palace walls, it was a chess game, and Anne had a pawn moving silently within her rival's ranks. The traitor had access to everything: phone calls, itineraries, press coordination, and internal discussion notes. The leaks were not reckless, they were timed. The goal wasn't to destroy Meghan's credibility all at once, but to undermine it piece by piece, moment by moment, until her presence in the Commonwealth arena appeared redundant, even chaotic. Behind the scenes, Anne's team used the information to preemptively position royal projects just ahead of Meghan's initiatives, offering the palace a calculated head start in the narrative. The result was devastating. Every time Meghan's influence seemed to gain traction, it was undercut by a more official announcement from London. Still, Meghan held firm, even as trusted allies warned her of inconsistencies and strange silences from within. She continued moving forward until the final sabotage arrived. On the day of the Commonwealth event, the mole's last act was to feed key intel into Anne's office, confirming the exact time Meghan's representatives would arrive, the names on their clearance list, and the internal communication Meghan's team planned to use in response. With this information, Anne executed the block with precision. Credentials were voided minutes before use. Communications were intercepted. Meghan's entire operation was blindsided, publicly sidelined without warning. And the source of the betrayal? Still cloaked in shadows, but now confirmed. That was the moment Meghan's suspicion crystallized into truth. She had been infiltrated, manipulated, and publicly humiliated from within her own house. Trust shattered, alliances questioned, and strategy compromised. But the betrayal didn't just expose a mole, it revealed something darker. Because this operation wasn't just the work of a rogue loyalist, it was orchestrated with guidance, timing, and cover that could only come from higher up. And while Meghan reels from this betrayal, the final blow is still to come, because the person pulling the strings isn't just Anne. He didn't say it publicly. He didn't even sign a formal decree. But King Charles allowed it. The decision to block Meghan's representatives came with a silent nod and a whispered message that is now echoing through the palace: let Anne handle it. To many inside the monarchy, it wasn't a shock. Charles's relationship with Meghan and Harry had been strained since the day they stepped back from royal duties. There were attempts to reconcile, to bridge the growing divide. But time and headlines had eroded trust. What Charles feared more than conflict was chaos. With the monarchy preparing for a historic transition of power, he wanted nothing clouding the narrative. No distractions. No new power players. The crown, in his eyes, needed to feel lean, focused, and unified. Meghan's increasing presence in Commonwealth matters, even unofficially, felt like a destabilizing force. And then came Anne. Reliable, discreet, unflinching. She didn't make demands, she presented solutions. She approached Charles not with complaints, but with a promise: she would contain the fallout, maintain diplomatic grace, and remove the complication without sparking a media inferno. All she needed was space to act. Quietly. Charles, exhausted from balancing family fractures with public expectations, gave her exactly that. It wasn't approval on paper. It was a low murmur in a private meeting. A quiet hand placed on Anne's shoulder. A phrase muttered under breath: do what you must. That was all Anne needed, and it was all Charles could give. But the illusion of royal neutrality didn't hold for long. A private conversation between Charles and his press secretary was leaked, details hazy, but the tone unmistakable. Charles had been briefed about Anne's plans in full, and though he never explicitly commanded it, his lack of resistance was damning. What followed was even more delicate. Commonwealth leaders, particularly in smaller nations with deep ties to Meghan's outreach efforts, began to question the silence. Some were looped in discreetly, reassured that this was a matter of internal consistency. Others felt blindsided, forced to adjust their agendas when Meghan's representatives abruptly vanished from attendance lists. Meanwhile, Meghan's team sought answers. They submitted formal clarification requests to the palace, first politely, then with growing urgency. For 72 hours, there was nothing. No call, no reply, no explanation. The silence wasn't accidental. It was strategy. The more time that passed, the more the moment lost its edge in the media cycle. And when the response finally came, it was brief, sterile, and devoid of accountability. The message was clear. The decision had already been made, and it wouldn't be reversed. For Charles, this move allowed him to remain above the fray. He had avoided public confrontation, yet effectively removed a piece from the board. For Anne, it was execution without obstruction. And for Meghan, it was yet another reminder that the walls around the monarchy were designed to close swiftly and silently. But even as Anne executes the block with surgical precision, another royal is preparing to intervene, and not in the way anyone expects. While Anne strikes and Charles consents, Catherine, Princess of Wales, remains silent, too silent. But insiders whisper that she's been working behind the scenes, not to support Meghan, but to ensure Anne doesn't go too far. What is Catherine's true play here? To the public, she has mastered the art of quiet composure, dignified, measured, unshakable. But within palace corridors, her silence isn't passivity, it's precision. Catherine walks a treacherous line caught between loyalty to Anne and her own deeply personal understanding of Meghan's isolation. She was once in that position an outsider, scrutinized, doubted, tested. But unlike Meghan, Catherine learned to operate from within, bending without breaking. And now, her silence carries weight. Those closest to her say that Catherine has remained in touch with Meghan long after Megxit, exchanging private messages that never passed through royal channels, coded check-ins, occasional reassurances, not friendship, but recognition. As Anne's campaign to block Meghan's presence in the Commonwealth intensified, Catherine's concern grew not necessarily for Meghan, but for what the monarchy risked losing, its fragile grip on moral authority. She understood what the others did, not that this was not just about power, it was about perception. And in the battle for public trust, perception is everything. Catherine's influence over Commonwealth youth programs has always been subtle but significant. She built networks with educators, health advocates, and emerging leaders, quiet foundations designed for longevity, not headlines. Many of those same circles began shifting uneasily as Meghan's exclusion became public. Catherine could see the cracks forming. Yet at public engagements she said nothing. Her eyes gave nothing away. Her tone never wavered. But staff behind the scenes described her as walking a blade's edge, carefully nudging advisors, quietly delaying briefings, and urging the palace to consider the optics before final decisions were made. She wasn't obstructing Anne, but she was tempering her. What few realized was that Catherine's long game wasn't about protecting Meghan, it was about protecting the future for George, Charlotte, and Louis. If the monarchy burned too many bridges now, it would be her children who inherited the wreckage. So she played both sides. She stood behind Anne in the official portrait, but behind closed doors, she began quietly reopening lines of communication with key Commonwealth stakeholders, offering soft reassurances while making no promises. Catherine wasn't offering Meghan a way back in, but she was ensuring there'd be something left if one day the crown needed reconciliation more than revenge. And still, her true intentions remain cloaked. Is she laying the groundwork for peace, or orchestrating a longer, more calculated path to power? With Catherine, nothing is ever obvious until it's already done. And just as the palace begins to calm from the chaos, The final twist erupts in the form of Meghan's shocking counterstrike. Just when the palace thought the story had ended, Meghan launches a global video address broadcast across key Commonwealth territories. In it, she doesn't mention Anne by name, but the message? Clear as crystal. I won't be silenced. The video is timed with ruthless precision, released just as the final applause fades inside the Grand Hall of the Commonwealth event, from which her representatives were so publicly barred. The crowd is still dispersing. Cameras are still rolling, but suddenly the spotlight turns not on tradition, not on royalty, but on a woman cast out and now speaking with thunderous calm. Meghan's voice, serene yet firm, cuts through the diplomatic airwaves. Her words are not confrontational, but piercing. She speaks of voices once welcomed, now discouraged. Of spaces meant for inclusion, now narrowed by fear. And of old shadows that still shape modern decisions. She never names names. She doesn't have to. Every viewer knows who and what she's referring to. Every line is a scalpel. Her tone is not desperate, it is deliberate. There are no accusations, only acknowledgements. No tears, only quiet defiance. She speaks as a former royal, yes, but more so, as a woman who has decided that exclusion won't erase her relevance. The broadcast sends shockwaves through the Commonwealth youth networks, especially among the same communities where Meghan once built direct ties. Many rally instantly. Others express confusion, and some express exhaustion torn between reverence for the monarchy and resonance with Meghan's message. The video fractures the calm Anne and Charles thought they had just restored. It throws the palace into emergency mode. Within hours, emergency meetings are convened. Communications staff are recalled. Drafts of rebuttal statements circulate, but none feel adequate. Because this time, the damage wasn't done in secret. It was global, curated, and unstoppable. Meghan had turned exclusion into exposure. The Crown's silence is no longer protection, it's a void being filled with speculation. Meghan doesn't demand a seat at the table, she simply builds her own. And now, millions are watching. This is no longer a quiet internal battle. The war for public opinion has officially begun, and this time, it's global. The palace, once confident in its silence, now faces an adversary that thrives in transparency. Meghan doesn't need titles. She has the microphone. And while Anne holds the legacy, Meghan holds the moment. Two women on opposite ends of the royal battlefield, each representing a vision of what the monarchy could be, or what it may never survive becoming. What started as a simple block at a single event has now escalated into a royal conflict with no clear end in sight. As the Crown fights to preserve its traditions and image, Meghan's camp is rewriting the rules. And one thing is certain, this is far from over. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.